Thank you to all of our presenters who told us about many of the different areas of research that we have in our department. There are lots that weren't represented here, but these were 4 excellent examples of the kind of work we do. And so now we have some time for questions. So I hope that you all wrote down your questions, or this is your chance to ask a linguist. So there are a lot of linguists in the room, not just these 4, so you can ask any questions about their talks. Let's start with asking questions about their talks, and maybe if there's a little time, if you have burning questions about linguistics, we can answer a couple of those. If not, we will have plenty of time to do that back in 10 Washington Place once we go over there for the science fair. So, does anybody have any questions for any of the speakers who give us their time today? Okay, Doug wants to talk really loud back there.
So on the last talk, for languages that have evidentials, do you think those are going to be simple or complex?
Depends what kind of evidential. So actually what we see in production is a similar kind of asymmetry that we see with modal verbs. So modal verbs like must have both these root meanings, so like an obligation, you must brush your teeth, and they have epistemic meanings, like, oh, that must be the mailman at the door. Evidentials have a roughly similar asymmetry between direct evidentials. So evidentials are about how do you know what you know? What's your knowledge? Where did you get your knowledge? So direct evidentials are usually about direct visual access, and kids produce these from age 2 across languages that have them, extracting away from other differences. And indirect evidentials, where you have to infer. So you actually mark this and you say, you know, I saw evidence of that event, like maybe something burned. I didn't actually see the burning, but I see the end state. Then we can say indirect marker, whatever the knowledge, and then the proposition about the burnt something, tree. And those kids start using those productively by about age 3, so we see a similar asymmetry with modal verbs. And then the other thing is that the indirect evidentials are also similarly tricky in comprehension tasks, which we also see with epistemics. And you'll notice I didn't talk about comprehension at all. So very good question, and they tend to parallel very related domains of language.
Thank you. It's for the same speaker, so maybe I'm going to make you get up again. Sorry. But I guess I was just wondering, with the examples that you showed us from Norwegian, English, French, those words for maybe all have the property of actually being compound words that put together the concept, mm-hmm. right? The possibility and the being, right?
Yeah,
Maybe, peut-être, and all that. And I was just wondering whether you've also looked at languages where those adverbs are not actually just putting together the concepts of might be, maybe, but words like, I don't know, in Italian you have like forse or magari, words which aren't explicitly just saying can be or might be. So, and if that makes a difference for this timing.
That's an excellent question. So the languages I've been working on so far are indeed those Indo-European languages that have taken like a biclausal construction with a modal verb, so it might be that. And that's been reanalyzed as, like diachronically, reanalyzed as an adverb. And actually this is another project. Lisa mentioned at the beginning that I'm interested in the relationship between what children learn and how languages change. And that project is called Where Do Maybes Come From? So actually I haven't looked at languages that have other strategies. And I think that's a great next place to go. One thing I've noticed is that in languages like French and English, where you also have like possibly or possible, those just don't show up as early. And I think there's a compound where they're also less frequent. And then to note that in the Bosnian Serbo-Croatian example, it's not might be, it's might that. So you get a different functional piece stuck to the in the adjunct. Yeah.
Other questions?
I have one about as construction in African American English. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. You had said before that the speakers that you interviewed did not consider that to be an intensifier. And you also mentioned that, you know, it varies, and then I'm also doing stuff about variation syntactically in African American English. But for me, as a New York speaker of African American English, this is always an intensifier. So if somebody has on a pink ass shirt, it's not just pink, it's Pepto-Bismol pink. It's nausea, heartburn, indigestion, upset stomach, diarrhea pink. So like, I'm curious to know where or which region you collected your data in where it does not mean an intensifier.
They're older speakers. The speakers were, you know, 30s, 40s, 50s. So Spears.
That's not old.
No, but I think that it's interesting that there might be some changes. First of all, there might be some regional differences, but there also might be changes. I remember a student telling me that she felt like she had 2 lexical items for that had the same sort of syntactic distribution of discourse as, and for her, one of them was not an intensifier. It was more of a pure expressive, and then one of them was an intensifier. So she was able to distinguish those 2 things in her dialect. So it could be that something like that is going on, and that things might be, changing or different from one dialect to the next.
Oh yeah, because I definitely have 2, because you have ass and then you have head ass. So it's like, you know, that's more of a descriptor, but as an adjective, mostly as an insult. But then you also do have ass as an intensifier, but just ass as an intensifier, which does attach to adjectives, which I could say I'm a boss bitch as well, but I can also say I'm a boss ass bitch, so I'm extra bossy. But it's not necessarily that it just turns things into adjectives, because it attaches to things that are already adjectives.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, and so it's funny. Ish and e are kind of funny like that too, because like, you know, ish can attach to an adjective and then make another adjective. So some people have the intuition that discourse ass actually prefers nouns. That was one of the original insights from Arthur Spears. So fool ass, clown ass, that kind of thing. But as we've seen, it has a pretty wide distribution of what it can attach to.
Okay.
You know you have them.
Going back to the very first speaker.
I think I can handle
The very
that.
first speaker, I thought.
Yes, and actually the first point you made, as far as names, like sounds and names, particularly vowel sounds, being associated with certain qualities.
Yeah.
How cross-cultural is that? So meaning, does that seem to be sort of something that happens at the cultural level, or something that happens at sort of a phonic level?
Yeah, so there is cross-linguistic evidence even for those associations of sounds like E and I with small things and sounds like ah and O with big things, and it seems to have something to do with the physiology of how we make them. When we make a sound like ah, we pull our tongues down and we open our mouth really wide, and so it's emblematic or symbolic of something large. And then by contrast, E has your mouth kind of scrunched up together. That being said, there's always exceptions to these, right? So like big, the English word, which has an I sound in it, right? So these are absolutely not deterministic connections between sound and meaning, but it is remarkable the extent to which they sort of languages show tendencies toward this sort of thing. Yeah, thanks for asking.
I also have a question for Laurel. Hi. Thank you. The name, so fascinating. I feel like one of the arguments that you sort of hinted at is that names are particularly subject to social contagion because they have so much meaning, right? So they're so personal. And you talked about sort of the ways that this operates for discrimination against African Americans. I think we're familiar with that. But I think I've read a little bit of literature about how this works in a classed way. So you talked about the names being sort of avoided if they're the names of your parents or grandparents and then coming back in the next generation. But there's an argument such that if you're 35 years old and your name is Brooklyn, you are rich. if you're 5 years old and your name is Brooklyn, maybe you're not so rich. So I wonder if you can speak to this pattern a little bit and how this social contagion of naming patterns might move sort of, I think, in a downward fashion through socioeconomic status.
Yeah, that seems like an intuitive trajectory, and the only literature I know on that was done in the 80s or 90s and didn't actually find it to bear out that names follow a kind of downward social trajectory. But I think that the researcher was working with birth records, and to the extent that he could get like mother's level of education from birth records, which I guess there's some state where that's available, that's not the best diagnostic, right, as you know, for something like social class. So yeah, I think my cop-out answer is that seems really relevant and there should be research on that, and I think we just don't have it now. But yeah, I mean, definitely it is true that certain names have certain what connotations, or yeah, social class connotations more generally, and there's also been findings that these things vary by state, right? The most popular names in a state in Wyoming are not going to be the same as in California or New York, for instance. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Greg has This is also a question about names. My question is if there's any data in, you were showing us data in how names change over time, and I was wondering if there is any data on that for people who change their names when they are, like, so not names as babies, but names changed later in life.
Great question. I don't know, and that would be a really neat thing to look into. Yep, absolutely. So if we can connect record name given at birth to name at various points in adulthood, yep, I would love to look into that. Yeah, thanks for asking. Greg?
I wonder if you can say anything about gendering of names. I get the impression that sound symbolism occurs there too, that
Yes.
there's more female names with sonorants and fricatives and more with male names with stops. So you have things like Greg and Laurel, for example.
That's been demonstrated too, yeah, so names given to female babies tend to be longer in terms of syllables, and I don't know how much of that is coming from like Latinate names that might end in an for instance, like Georgina versus George type of thing, but that certainly shows up in English. Names given to female babies tend to have, exactly like you said, more sonorants, and they also tend to have E more, which connects with that sound symbolism again, the smaller sound. Yeah. Yeah, that being said, N is a sonorant, and N at the end of baby boy names has become immensely popular in recent years, so there's some indication that some of these gender divisions might be eroding a little bit. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, you're gonna speak really loud and I'm gonna repeat it.
I can speak. Wait, me?
Yeah.
I can speak loudly enough, I think.
Go for it.
Okay, so it's also a question about names. Okay. But you showed us a graph where the names look, where you said the names skipped every other generation, right? Mm-hmm. Is that a trend that's predicted to continue throughout time?
Great question. I'd love to know. The issue is that, I mean, we only have American birth records going back to 1880. So we've seen these big V-shaped swings. The question is, do we see any V-shaped swings that are more compressed so that we can see down, up over the course of 120 years? And nothing comes to mind, but now I'm gonna go home and look at the data and find out. Yeah.
You're giving us all great ideas for new research, so thank you very much for that. More questions?
I just wanted to point out about that thing about male names ending with N. Seems like there could be sort of a judgment, you know, there's sort of a political decision there, sort of a cultural decision about getting away from traditional masculinity. Right? If that's not what male names are traditionally supposed to end with, then this is giving males names that don't fit into that concept of masculinity.
Traditional patterns. It's interesting. Yeah. At the same time, names given to boys and girls, baby boys and baby girls, are still very different, right? So Yeah, there's still a clear separation in which names are given, but what's changing is the sounds that are given in the names. And actually, research has tracked so-called androgynous names, so names that are given to baby boys and baby girls about equally, and found that over the decades, those tend to skew female. With researchers have attributed to kind of the way our society allows girls to have boys things, but not boys to have girl things. So as soon as a name like Taylor or Ashley becomes female-coded, parents are going to stop giving it to male babies. Yeah, so the genderedness is still there, it just may be manifesting differently. Yeah.
So, you know, if ideas about masculinity and femininity vary from one culture to the next, do we see differences in the sounds of little boy names and little girl names in societies that have very different ideas about masculinity and femininity than our own?
I got asked this question by an undergraduate student many years ago, and I said, you should go and find out, and I don't think they ever did. So I still don't know the answer to this, but yep, this is a great question, yeah.
Does anybody have another burning linguistic question, even if it wasn't addressed by one of our speakers today? We could take one or two of those. Thank you for your burning question back there.
So this is actually for Patricia. I'm just gonna quickly say I'm not a linguistics major, so it's gonna be like wicked simple compared to the rest of these. So I come from an English background, kind of going into this, and like writing center, English literature, that sort of stuff. So I guess my question to you is this. What is your response to people who insist that standard American English is the only acceptable dialect in academia?
There are a lot of people in this room who might want to address this question, and I think that if any of you have an opinion on it, you should jump in right now. Tricia can answer too, but I know that there are other people in the room who may have an opinion.
Yeah, there are lots of people in this room who might have an opinion about that.
You're in Baltimore, come on, give us your small liberal arts college answer.
Fight the hegemony, I don't know.
As a linguist. It's a hard question.
So, yeah, so there's a balance because, like, you know, to have access to power, it helps to have command of the way that the people in power speak and write. Most of the people in power speak and write, and so that can give people access to power. But folks who claim that that's the only way, that often tends to be linked to attitudes about the unconscious attitudes that I wanted to raise folks' awareness of, that has to do with more value judgments about sort of people being better and more proper and more right. And so to the extent that we can divorce those, the connection of those two things, which I think is sometimes unexamined in a lot of us in academia, for, you know, on the good side and the bad side. So you can speak British English and, you know, you get great positive valuation, you know, doors open for you in the US if you have a British accent. So the evaluation of an accent can work for you or against you. I guess that's, I think others might have. No, I don't want to pass the buck, but I mean, this is something that you can look at from a lot of different perspectives.
I have a thing too.
Yeah, say your thing.
So, the main difference between a language and a dialect is an army, is it not? That's why, for the longest time, Jamaican patois or African American English would be called a dialect instead of a language, while Spanish and Portuguese get to be separate languages, right? So, really, this is an extension of an age-old elitist and racist way of thinking that protects the ivory tower from people who would otherwise sully its ideals and threaten its power. So the idea that one has to speak in a certain way in order to be included is a way of keeping people out of that institution. It is carried on through, you know, academia, especially like English literature, because my mom's an English teacher, she's been an English teacher for 22 years, so I've been hearing about this for a long time. And it goes through places like linguistics and other places as well, even to the point where you look at certain theories, and the theories themselves were not built to accommodate things that are not the standard language. So we really have to be careful about it, like, we can acknowledge the fact that in order to keep ourselves from being othered and kept out of spaces, we do have to learn these things. We do have to learn these languages. We do have to learn how to walk and talk and appear and present in such a way that we will be accepted in these spaces. However, it is also a very dangerous mindset, and one that has been used to oppress and keep people out and down for centuries. That's all.
Kimberly is a graduate student in our department.
Yeah, I would respond to that by saying that yes, it's a social fact that many people believe that. But you need to think about what kind of privilege does that confer on the people who speak that variety natively. Right? If you go up in a white middle-class family, then presto, you already speak that. It's not a problem. And it disadvantages anybody who doesn't. So that's a way of, as she was saying, maintaining the authority and the power of the people who already possess the variety. And they're indeed the ones who get to define what the variety is that is valued because of their social power. So believing that you can only do these kinds of things in that variety is a form of linguistic prejudice. And it's tied, as Kimberly was saying, in many cases simply to racism.
Hi, I teach a class called Linguistic Discrimination. All of
A
this,
PhD student who graduated from our department a few years ago.
yes, currently at Pomona College, thank you. All of this, yes, thank you, Kimberly, that was fire. One other thing I want to add, though, and Greg sort of went in this direction, is that speakers tend to have this ideology that, like, language can't be left to the masses. Like, if we just let people talk however they talk, like, there will be a breakdown of society, right? And you see this sort of even more strongly in languages that aren't English, right? This is what the Real Academia Española does. This is what the French Academy does. Like, someone has to protect the language from the people that will ruin it. And you get that argument in academic spaces too, right? Oh, it's just not gonna be clear if we let people talk however. It's gonna break down the nature of the argument. You can't possibly do this. But that really underestimates speakers and listeners' tolerance for variation. We experience massive variation all the time when we move through our lives and still communicate effectively with other people. So the only thing that I would add to that argument is that there's a little bit of panic about what happens if there's variation that's totally not linguistically founded and based on all of these other social ideologies.
What do you mean by not linguistically founded?
That people can tolerate variation and that it doesn't have to be one way for us to understand other people's arguments.
But I'd also like to add to that that people do tolerate variation, but also to the extent that they think they can. So, as some of you folks know even more than me, you know, people in power seem to not be able to understand people who speak who have less power in a given society. This has been shown in you know, between two dialects in, what is it, you guys, this is a classic paper that in South America or something. Anyway, my point is the people who are less in power tend to be able to understand the people in power better than the people who are in power can understand the people. So even though you know, people should be able to understand each other sort of just as well, given their ability to their tolerance for variation, still people's social perceptions affect how well they even try to accommodate to variation in their interlocutor.
I'll just add to all this, I'm a native speaker of both German and French, and you've heard of the Académie Française. There is no such thing in Germany, or rather there is, but nobody knows about it much. But still, German is doing just as well as French is.
We have time for one more question.
Kind of a follow-up to that whole discussion, less related to the oppressor and racism aspects of it, but more just about the initial phrasing of the question, which was about writing in academic situations. And my question is about how do we know personally when we are writing? Like, what would an idealized writing look like when we are writing with jargon that seems perfectly clear to the people we are writing for in the present tense? How much should we consider what people in the future might know about what we are saying? And I know maybe it's silly to ask if academics should worry about using jargon in their, that no one else will know about. But does that make sense?
I'm gonna posit a thought bubble on that one. So, oh, Jesus, okay.
I'm just going to posit a thought bubble to your follow-up question, in the sense that literature from Shakespeare on through to the current day gets studied all the time in academic settings, and we write about it and we talk about it every day in academic settings. And it brings to the point where we are able to use language skills, things that are abstract representations that we use on a day-to-day basis with our own individual idiolects, ways of speaking, to understand what people were saying then as we understand people who speak now. And we also do it in a way that allows us to perpetuate our biases. So there's been this resurgence, at least in my mind, of people studying African American literature and then finding opportunities to perpetuate biases by using the N-word and say, oh, but we're talking about it in an academic setting, so it no longer counts. But really, we understand what it's doing. We use these abstract representations to think about what people said before and what people say now. And so it's really, I think, the point that it's our social biases and our perceptions that are feeding into what we're investigating more so than the actual linguistic nature of what we're understanding.
Okay, I think we're gonna leave it with that. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah's also a grad student in our department. So I would love to invite you all back over right now to 10 Washington Place, which is Caddy Corner, if you have that word, across the street. We have food, we have science, more science for you to see. And if you're an NYU alumni or a current student, then we'd love to take a picture over at 10 Washington Place. I'll try and make more noise about when that's going to be, but do expect that. So everybody should make your way over. There's some food, and more to look at.